Most young women I speak to who have been subjected to what the law would call sexual intercourse without consent are told by well-meaning friends that they haven't been. And I hear it every week, and it presents like this: oh my God, that's awful, that's terrible. You know, he seemed like such a nice guy. Thank God he didn't rape you.
In 1837, Horace Mann created the education system, a system at the time designed to pump out factory workers and professors. The same system that is still being used today in the 21st century. Now, Mann's system is backfiring. We are being moulded by the same industrial system that has existed for close to 200 years. That system delivers us into a digital economy that has no need of our outdated skills. This isn't our teachers' fault. This isn't the government's fault. This is due to a rapidly changing world full of technology and unforeseen circumstances. And us Gen Zs are caught in the middle. Welcome to the Driven Young Podcast, the podcast for stressed, overwhelmed young Australians, teaching you practical life skills you can implement now to set yourself up in life. And now your host, Byron Dempsey.
Welcome back to the Driven Young Podcast, and I'm just going to cut the music for this intro. As you would have heard by the snippet and by the title of this episode, today we are covering a very serious and a heavy topic. But I would argue this could be the most important episode yet. Today I'm joined by Brent Sanders. Brent Sanders is one of Australia's most respected communicators in the field of workplace harassment, bullying and discrimination. He also presents lectures throughout Australia on sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in the senior secondary schools and universities. Following a distinguished career in the police force, he started his own business presenting seminars and lectures on workplace harassment, conflict resolution and offender psychology. I just want to talk a little bit about this episode before we switch over to Brent. Brent came to my school years ago and did a presentation on sexual crime and assault, splitting up the boys and girls into separate groups. To date, my friend and I still talk about this presentation, and it highlighted a massive issue I was so completely unaware of at the time. I talk a lot about what I think school should be teaching us, and I am sure by the end of this episode, you will be as shocked as me that school does not cover this. It's seriously mind-blowing. I truly believe if every young person in Australia or the world listened to this episode or listened to one of Brent's presentations, sexual crimes would drop drastically. Throughout this episode, Brent highlights the importance of educating young people around this topic, what he has seen in over 25 years of presenting this information at schools, having been involved in a number of sexual crime cases, why stranger danger has conditioned us to believe if we stay away from strangers, we are safe, what the law defines as sexual assault, the consequences of committing a crime like this, and so much more. Now, I just want to speak directly to the boys. I understand, I assume, and I hope that the boys listening to this show would never sexually assault someone, and I know as a young male myself, when people talk about this topic, we can often feel attacked and grouped in with these offenders, even though we know it's something we would never ever do. Throughout this episode, Brent and I are really shining a light on the most common scenario. 99% of the people who approach him and file for sexual assault crimes are young women, most often filing a case against a young man. This isn't to say these crimes don't happen to men, but we are focusing on the most important issue. It's like when the Black Lives Matter movement was going viral and people started talking about all lives matter. Those people aren't wrong, like all lives do matter, but the Black Lives Matter movement isn't saying only Black Lives Matter, they're just trying to shine a light on an issue that should not exist in 2020. I see it all the time. A girl talks about how women are treated poorly and 1 in 3 women experience sexual harassment, and a common response from the guys is, well, some men are falsely accused. This is such a disrespectful response because these women are often trying to vent and shine a light on an important issue, and these boys take it as an attack against them and basically gaslight them. Again, I'm not saying the small percentage of men who are falsely accused are any less important, but relative to the amount of women who are actually sexually assaulted, it's a tiny, tiny number. Hence why this conversation is more focused on the bigger issue. So boys, go in with an open mind. You're about to learn a lot of important information. I'm 22 and I didn't know half of the stuff he was talking about. Now, my message to the girls. Brent speaks in front of a few hundred schoolgirls a week, and he gets about 20 to 30 girls approach him after a talk, who after hearing his talk, realized they were sexually assaulted. This show gets a lot more than a few hundred downloads, and it also has a majority female audience. So I am aware many people listening to this may have the same realization that these girls had. If this is you, I recommend listening to the entire episode as Brent gives his advice about what actions you can take right at the end. And make sure you share this with your friends. As I mentioned, I believe through simple education like this, we can lower the amount of sexual crimes committed. And if this episode can help one guy second guess his actions on a night out and prevent a girl from going through something as horrible as this, then this podcast has been all worth it. My final message is, if you are a regular listener, I talk a lot throughout my podcast. I would argue it's almost 50-50 between my guests and I. But this episode, I hand the reins over to Brent. It is so far out of my depth, and he is so knowledgeable in this field, backing up everything with statistics and law, and I would say this episode is more like 90-10. Now, I know I have some young listeners, and I believe it doesn't matter what age you listen to this. In fact, the earlier the better, in my opinion, but this is a serious conversation. There is no swearing or disrespect. It's a very mature conversation. He doesn't share anything too triggering, and mainly uses metaphors to get his point across. So if you are a young listener, I highly recommend you stick around, but it's totally up to you to decide if this is a conversation you are ready for, because we do use a lot of language that can be very confronting if you're new to this. Now, as per usual, guys, please share this episode with your friends, especially this episode. Send me a DM on Instagram if you enjoyed this conversation, and make sure you follow my account and the Driven Young podcast for more content and to stay up to date. Plus, I would love to get some feedback on this episode. Brent is just scratching the surface here, and if this does well, I would love to bring him back on the show. So DM me and let me know what you thought. Now, over to Brent. Brent, welcome so much to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Really excited to talk about this. It's a serious topic, but I think it's really, really important. Obviously, a bit of framing for the listeners. I heard you speak at my school back in 5-6 years ago or something like that. And me and my best friend, we bring you up regularly about that workshop. Was it an hour, 2 hours?
A couple of hours, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so powerful. And what we learned in the education and everything. So that's why I wanted to bring you on. We're kind of going to be talking about educating around sexual assault, some serious topics. We'll try to keep it lighthearted, but we're going to get quite detailed as well.
Yeah.
But before we jump into all that stuff, I'd love to know a little bit about you, what you did after high school, and kind of just your story. How did you get to what you're doing?
Yeah, I grew up in New Zealand. And
so did I.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. Whereabouts?
In Wellington.
Okay, do you in Timaru?
I've got cousins in Timaru.
There you go.
Yeah, I have. I've got cousins own a pub in Timaru and stuff, and I've got families from down that way, Oamaru and all around that neck.
Oamaru.
Further
I
south.
say quite often.
I grew up in Wellington, New Zealand there, and I joined the police actually at 19, just a young bloke, very young. I was actually the youngest recruit in the police academy, so graduated as the youngest police officer in the country, and if you told me back then that I would leave the police, leave New Zealand, come to Australia and run seminars, it was sort of a million miles away from where my head was.
It always is, I find.
Yeah, it's funny where life takes you. So, joined the police about 84. I was in the police through to the 90s. And look, long story short, I'd worked a little bit around sex crimes in that area. We were starting to get interested in criminal profiling. I did a couple of talks, and I was one of the talks I did was there was a woman from New South Wales Education Department there, and asked if I'd be interested in putting some courses together for schools. So that's nearly 25 years ago. So that's how that whole transition started. And so now for me, I go into schools all around Australia. I've put nearly 900,000, I think, students through my talks. The school that you were at, Byron, is one that I've been going into for probably 15 years. And speak to young men and young women about everything from sexual crime to, often with the young men, to choice and consequences and all those types of things.
Yeah, awesome. And so you've been doing that for quite a while now.
Yeah, long time, 25 years, nearly 25 years.
Yeah, and so you're speaking 3-4 schools a week sort of thing?
Yeah, schools each day. I do quite a bit of corporate work as well. That was a more latter sort of a part of what I do. So I go into schools, I do university talks. Universities usually bring me in at the start of that university year, when students are transitioning from home to university, often talking in the colleges and regional universities. All the first years are coming to live on campus. So those talks are part of orientation week. I have a group of corporations that I work with as well. I do all their training on harassment, bullying and that type of thing. Yeah,
awesome. And so obviously I wanted to bring you on because I think this is a very serious topic, and I think it's something everyone should be well aware of. And I wanted to basically bring you on to do your workshop essentially that I went through when I was younger on the podcast. Obviously, we've only got an hour to do. But I guess we'll just kind of start off with, why do you think this is so important? Why do you think we educating around sexual assault should be, much more widespread? We were speaking about it before. There's a lot of issues. And just by some simple education, we can greatly benefit the men and the women.
Yeah, look, 100%. I mean, when I go into schools and universities as well, they get me to do my talk gender specifically, and it's probably not politically correct, I guess, but it actually works quite well, because when you get into that area with young men and you're talking about, sexual assault and consent, you want them to engage, you want them to ask questions. And I find that, when the young men are on their own, the young women are on their own, you get a lot more of that interaction and chat. When you bring them together, they're quite conscious of the other group and everything goes a little quiet. So I find, there's multiple layers, I guess, but there is real benefit, for example, for young men knowing these terms that they've heard of, like consent and things around that and sexual intercourse. There's real benefit in them knowing what the definition of those terms are and what that actually means for a young person on a Saturday night and things such as that. So it's taking it, for me, from the Crimes Act, running it through real life situations and then inviting discussion around that. One thing I often say too, when I'm speaking to young men, that although the age group that I speak to, which is primarily sort of 15, 16 through to their early 20s, without doubt, that's a high-risk age group for young women to be targeted. But I think it's also worthy of saying to the young man that at primary school age, the boys are actually at higher risk than the girls are. So this brings in a discussion that, sexual crime can be male to female, it can be male to male, it can be female to female, it can be female to male. But the groups that I speak to, primarily, it is a male offender targeting a female.
Let's be real. Yes, there's all that other stuff happening, but let's look at the biggest problem, which is, as we're talking about kind of young men and women.
It is.
And it's not, as I mentioned to you, I think a lot of us have this perception, thanks to Hollywood and movies, that sexual assault is some creepy white dude in a trench coat in an alleyway who's following down a drunk girl. It's happening at parties.
Yeah, look, it is. And it's interesting, that's a really valid point, Byron. I think I even take it back even further that, everyone listening to this podcast in Australia, for example, has done the Stranger Danger program at primary school.
Yeah.
So when kids are little at primary school, and I've got 2 university-aged kids now, but probably year 2, year 3, they get hit with that stranger danger. Strangers are dangerous. Strangers are dangerous. So it creates that perception at a very young age. If you stay away from strangers, you're staying away from danger, so you'll be safe. And so, if I'm talking, for example, to a group of young 17-year-old young women in a school, and I say, picture in your mind what a person looks like who's the most likely person to commit a sexual offence against you. As you're saying, those young women have been conditioned through TV, movies, DVDs, Netflix, Stan, and at 7 or 8 years of age, they were told strangers do this stuff. The reality is totally different. Strangers are responsible for a very, very small percentage of sexual crime in Australia. Overwhelmingly, the young women who come forward to talk to me almost exclusively have had a sexual offence committed against them by a guy of similar age, who they know socially, who they would describe as being somebody that they thought that they could trust.
Yeah.
So it's very much, sadly, the young men that I'm speaking to in that same age group who are the most likely to be crossing that line.
And so what we're saying, because that's such a good point, right? And so what we're saying is here, these girls think they're safe because they've been conditioned to think that I'm staying away from strangers, I'm staying away from these men, I'm just surrounded by my friends, therefore I'm safe.
Yeah.
When in reality, looking at the statistics and the numbers, you're actually more dangerous to be.
Yeah, again, Brian, we've also got to be careful and say, the fault of sexual crime is 100% at the foot of the offender.
Yeah.
And so we need to do as much work with young men as we do with young women.
Yes.
So, for example, where you did my course at school, I did sort of half a day with the boys, I did half a day with the girls. That's the way that we've got to approach that.
It's so important because splitting them up, like the environment with just the boys, it was almost fun. You're talking about this, we had a good time, it got serious.
Yeah.
If the girls were there, it would have been very uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable for everybody.
We would have felt I think we would have felt like we were being targeted, like boys stop doing this to girls.
Yeah. Look, you're right, and you can, in my view, and I've been doing this a long time, you can present this information to both young men and young women in a way which is honest, open. Yes, it's confronting, of course it is, but you want to do it in a way that everybody walks away with some benefit.
Yes.
So we decrease the likelihood of this stuff happening. Yeah. One of the things that we spoke about earlier when you said, what are some of the key areas, that I cover? One thing I've discovered, Byron, whether it's talking to students in year 10 or students at university, everybody's heard the terminology. everybody's heard of these terms, like, awful terms like rape. Now, everyone's heard of it. Everybody knows, rape's pretty much like, sexual intercourse without consent. When you start to peel the onion back a little further than that, what you find is, even people my age, their knowledge drops off the precipice. So as just an example, the word rape doesn't exist legally in most states and territories in Australia. New South Wales, we threw the term rape out of the New South Wales Crimes Act 39 years ago.
Wow.
So for 39 years in this state, you cannot be charged with rape. It doesn't exist. We've replaced that with the term sexual assault. Now, this is all being a bit pedantic about terminology, but what it highlights is some of the folks listening in are going, goodness, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
I had no idea.
I had no idea.
Now, when you start thinking that, then the little voice in your head says, goodness, well, what else don't I know? So everyone knows the term rape. Very few people know what it's actually called specifically in their state. Now, some states, there's a couple, still use that term, Queensland, Victoria. Then we've got this thing, okay, well, so once we get our head around the fact that rape is sexual intercourse without consent, okay, we've got that, let's move on. The problem there is most people's definition of sexual intercourse as it applies to a sexual crime, they take from a Year 7 biology textbook.
Yeah.
Now, that bears no resemblance to the legal definition. Now, the flow on from that is, I would say without any hesitation, 9 out of 10 young women that I speak to each week who come forward to tell me that they have been subjected to sexual intercourse without consent. Now, that's an offence that carries in this state up to 14 years imprisonment. 9 out of 10 of them will tell you they had no idea that had happened to them until they actually sat in the seminar, because they go to girlfriends or friends, guys and girls, tell them what's happened. They go, oh my goodness, that's awful, that's terrible. Thank God you weren't raped, because it reverts back to the very narrow biological definition of intercourse versus the very, very broad legal definition. Then we go into things like consent. Everyone knows. Everyone listening to this podcast knows. An intimate exchange, sexual activity has to be consensual. Otherwise, it's illegal. It's illegal. It's a crime. But we don't tell these young people what consent means.
Isn't it crazy?
Yeah. We just don't, and people don't know. And I have teachers who are standing down the back of my seminars who will quietly come up during the break and go, goodness, I didn't actually know that. Now, some of them are teaching PDHP at school. I'm not criticising them, but we know the slogans. If you get 100 young people, young men, young women in a seminar, I'm doing a seminar this afternoon with 200 young men in year 11, right? I'll say to them, if you're having intimate exchange with another person, how do you know they've consented? What do they do or say? 99% of them will say, when they say yes. So we have this idea that if a person says yes, they have consented. Now, yeah, that may be the case, but that's certainly not the blanket case. But what ends up happening is young women believe the same thing. If I say yes, it's consent. Young men think if I'm with somebody doing something and they're not that comfortable I'm doing, if I can put pressure on them to get them to say yes,
or give them
stop saying no,
a few more drinks,
whatever, well then that's consensual. It's not. The word yes doesn't exist in the Crimes Act under any legal definition of consent. Consent is giving permission or changing your mind freely. Now, it's that freely aspect that I focus on. That's what a police investigation focuses on. Because if we go out there and say, if you start out saying no and you change your mind, well, that's consent. It could be, but you've also just described the actions of 99% of young women I speak to who have had sexual offences committed against them. Then we were talking before, Byron, about alcohol and or drugs with the impact of consent. Young people know to consent you've got to be sober. A drunk person can't consent. But again, we don't tell them what that means.
What is drunk?
Legally, what is drunk?
We don't. It's not like we've got breathalyzers on us.
Yeah.
We don't know what drunk is. We don't know how many drinks they might have had. It's
100%. I was at a university earlier this year, right at the start of the year, and I was speaking to some young women, and this came up about they were at a university college. I said, if you went to a party tonight, there was a drunk person there, can that person consent? No, definitely not. Fantastic. What does that mean? And there's like this silence in the room. And then a very brave young woman put her hand up. She said, I've never really thought about it. She said, but I think if I had to in an exam situation, I'd say if you have one alcoholic drink, you've imbibed that into your bloodstream. That could impact your thought process, which is connected to consent. So she said, if I had to guess, I'd say maybe one alcoholic drink negates a person's ability to consent. That was a very well-constructed answer, but it's totally wrong.
Of course, that's one drink, I'm still clear as day.
Yeah, well, that's the P-plate test.
Yeah.
If you're drinking one drink on your P's, you get pulled up on an RBT breath test, you've lost your license. In that same university talk, I had guys coming afterwards, and I asked the same question. And a guy said, and he was doing it quite openly. He said, I think if you're at a party and a girl's really, really drunk and sort of laid out on the couch or something because she's really drunk, I think consent could be an issue.
Basically passed out.
Well, yeah, it is, but it doesn't start there. And the young women in that same college, their view was, I think one drink's an issue. The guys are going, I think possibly when someone's almost unconscious. Now, the legal test is very much an observational test. Very simply put, once a person has had enough alcohol or drugs that any person observing them can see the effects of those, now we've got a question.
And you can tell. Like, let's not lie. You've seen people at a party. You're going to a party. You can almost within, as you walk in the door, you can kind of tell who's quite drunk and who has only just started. It might even be 8 o'clock, but they've been preying since 4 o'clock.
Yes.
And so they rock up to the party already drunk.
100%. And, of course, Byron, in amongst all this, of course, we've got the moral and ethical decision-making process too. Like, morally and ethically, should a person hook up with someone who's so drunk that they're clearly incapable of consent? Well, of course not. But what the legal stuff does on the back of that, I think, for the young people I speak to, is give them some real black and white stuff. And, with the older groups that I speak to, year 12 and university, I actually run a comparison to the responsible service of alcohol test. Now, Byron, you and your mates go down the pub for a beer on a Saturday night. Before you get in, you've got to show ID.
Yep.
Next thing is the person on the door will have a chat. Where have you been? Have you been drinking?
Yeah.
They're doing the responsible service of alcohol test. And there'll be people listening into this podcast who have lined up to get into a licensed premises with friends, and some haven't been allowed in.
I haven't.
Yes.
Once I was completely sober.
Right.
And he's like, your eyes look dilated. Are you on
Right.
drugs?
Right.
No, I'm fine. I wasn't allowed in.
Well, as that highlights that, no test is infallible. It's either way. But you're right. And in a sense, once people get their head around that, the responsible service of alcohol test is a very observational test. We've got people listening in perhaps to the podcast here who work in licensed premises, and they'll say, if somebody approaches the bar visibly drunk, I can't serve them because they failed the test. Once you get your head around that, my approach is it's a very, very similar test for consent.
Right.
Once a person has had enough alcohol where they would fail the responsible service of alcohol test, they've also had enough alcohol or drugs where the law is going to start to really question their capacity to consent.
Does this, if let's say I see a girl or something like that, and I visually see she's quite drunk and stuff, if I just do my own thing and then she comes onto me, what's the situation there?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I guess from a legal perspective, it would say if a really drunk person tries to come onto you, the law would say a reasonable person would see how drunk they are and recognise that they are incapable of consenting to an intimate exchange. So bottom line is, you couldn't use as a legal defence, well, they approached me. Yes, they could hardly speak. Yes, they could hardly walk. But she did put her arm around me, so that meant I was entitled to have sex with her.
Right.
The law would say, well, no, because under any reasonable test, you could see that she was incapable of providing reasonable consent for an intimate exchange.
And I've seen that before. I've seen guys, it's like, no, go sit down. You're way too drunk. It's all the time. Girls often get very handsy when they're very drunk. That's when their confidence comes out. And so, I've seen that happen a lot, and that's a great situation. And we're not trying to be buzzkills here, like, never party, never hook up or anything.
No,
we're just
trying to be respectful. And the question that often comes up in my talks too around this, Byron, is what if the guy's drunk as well?
Yes.
So you get two drunk.
In my head.
Yeah, you get two drunk people getting together. And that's a really valid question. I guess the way that I approach that is there's many situations, if we're just going from a legal perspective, and sometimes this gives clarity around the discussion, there's many situations where two people affected by alcohol can get together and a crime is committed. An obvious one could be you and I at a pub and we both get drunk. Now, or at a party. We're at a party, we both get drunk. Well, we haven't committed a crime. We're quite entitled to get drunk. But if we meet at the party, you're drunk and I'm drunk, and for no reason, without any provocation, I just punch you in the face, well, that's assault, right? Clean, easy, we know. So police are called. Right. Now, when the police get there and they're having a sort of chat to people, or, they start to work out what's happened, they can see that I threw a punch and I hit you. No provocation, not self-defense, nothing. Well, that's assault. You're drunk, but you got hit. You're the victim. You have every right to charge me if you choose to. As the person who threw the punch, I'm the offender. Now, I'm drunk as well, but I have no right to claim because I'm drunk.
Gotcha.
You can't charge me.
Yes.
So if we translate that across to, say, a sexual intimate exchange at a party, there are situations where two people affected by alcohol will get together, where one of them will perhaps say allege the following day or go to the police and say, I got really, really drunk at this party, woke up realising this had happened, this has happened. As the police look into that, they may find that, yes, this person who's making the complaint was very drunk.
It's like some people could argue they weren't drunk, some people could argue they were.
Yeah.
So I can see from an investigative perspective, it's very, very difficult.
And, when we look at any laws like this, Byron, and you're right, any law that you look at, you can take it to the nth degree and go, oh, well, what about in that type of situation?
Yeah.
What I tend to do in my lectures is I say, but let's look at the spirit behind the law. Why do we have a law that says it is morally, ethically and legally wrong to engage in an intimate exchange with somebody who is too drunk to consent? Well, because it's morally, ethically and legally wrong. So that law is their advantage or